Well, welcome back, everybody, to our second last session of the day for the Manning Best Practices Forum. Thanks for sticking around. My name is Kate Harrison. I am a partner at Summa Strategies, which is a public affairs, public relations firm in Ottawa. But more importantly, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm the program lead for the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, and very pleased to be speaking with you today and joined by Chelsea Schick, who is the Director of Events for the Atlas Network. We're going to be having a conversation this afternoon on gatherings and events in a post-COVID world and how to get the most meaning out of these events. Obviously, typically we would have this conversation in person. We're all very regretful that can't happen right now. We hope to see a change on that sometime, perhaps this fall, and certainly ahead of next year's conference. But really, the COVID pandemic has turned events on its head. And we thought it would be really valuable for those that are tuning in this afternoon, many of you as organization leaders, grassroots members who are looking to either participate in or host events yourselves, to think about what some of the changes have been for the events space because of the COVID pandemic. Some things may be worth keeping, other things may be worth ditching altogether. But I think it's fair to say that we are expecting a fair bit of reform and change as far as events are concerned following this pandemic. So I'm joined by Chelsea here. Chelsea has a great amount of experience in organizing events. She hosts an annual dinner that has hundreds of people attend. She's hosted thousands of events with thousands of people and hundreds of events for nonprofit needs and other things. So thanks, Chelsea, very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Kate. I'm so excited to be here. And the rumor is this is the first events session in the Best Practices Forum. I had that right. So I just think that is so highly impactful. You're meeting such a gap because event planners, we don't talk to each other enough. We're always behind the scenes, making sure everyone else is accommodated for. And this is really just such a need to elevate the movement and make sure that we're reaching people in a way. So thanks for hosting me. And I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, no, so very, very happy to have you. And you're right. Often the thought goes into just getting the event planned and executed and getting it done. And there's not a lot of idea sharing and exchange. So really looking forward to the next 50 minutes or 55 minutes that we have together. So we're going to be going through a few things related to types of events, the production that goes into this. We're going to spend a little bit of time as well talking about platforms that these events can be hosted on, particularly now that we're looking at online events or hybrids. Talk a little bit about the prioritization and thinking and considerations that goes into monetizing these events. So what you need to keep in mind if you're setting registration fees or things of that nature. And then some other best practices really that we've learned over the course of the last year and what event planners or those that are event volunteers can take away to try and execute the best event possible for the different types of needs. I'd also say I encourage you to reach out via the Q&A and chat to ask questions along the way, and I'll make sure that we get those into Chelsea throughout the presentation. So without further ado, Chelsea, maybe I'll throw it over to you. I know we have some slides that we're going to work through, and I think we want to get started by talking about different event types, but I'll throw it over to you to kick off the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much. So yeah, let's just go ahead and dive on in. I've kind of framed the presentation part of this and we'll interject Q&A. So Kate, just interrupt me if there are timely questions that you want to have me go a little bit deeper in on. But really, we're talking about virtual, in-person, and hybrid events. And I'm really excited about the in-person and hybrid part because I think there's a light at the end of this tunnel where hopefully we can start talking about what meeting in person is going to look like. And I've tried to incorporate as many, tangible takeaways into this presentations, including you'll get a sample COVID-19 clause to include into your in-person contract. So that's kind of a golden nugget. And you'll also get an example of what a event response plan might look like. So, I really tried to make this as useful as possible as you're getting ready to move into that sphere. But I think it's also still makes a lot of sense to talk about virtual events and to start off there because we've learned a lot and we've all been in this space for about a year. I think we all probably have, knowledge to share on this front. But, let's just go ahead and dive in there and talk about what we've learned. And what it takes to choose the right kind of a platform. So before you really start diving into the how, so we as event planners, whether you're full-time or part-time event planning, we're really good at the how, right? How to get something done. And I think our minds naturally gravitate towards the how very quickly. But I think we skip over the why, right? That big juicy why. Why are you even organizing a gathering? What's even the point of meeting? And that sounds so harsh, but this is the way we talk about audience engagement. You need the audience to connect with your why. What is the point? Why are you doing this? And so spend some strategic time thinking about your why, and then also start thinking about what you as the host want to get out of your audience. So you as an organization or a person with, with values are trying to engage other people. And what are you trying, why involve them? What are they bringing to the table? Why do you want them to join you at this event? And that having questions to those two things are really going to help you determine what kind of functionality you're going to want to get out of your event platform. And that the third area of strategic thinking I would really start thinking about is, what does audience engagement really look like? Because when we talk with our event planners, I think the number one complaint is virtual is just not that engaging. How do you create more engagement? And I don't think we're all on the same page with what engagement means. So the way I see it is there's two ways you can approach audience engagement. And this is going to change how you approach your platform selection. There's a one-way engagement experience that the attendee experiences. And this is where you're pushing content in a compelling way that's highly engaging for your audience. And it's probably expertly produced, a lot like what I'm seeing here at the Best Practices Forum. This is just absolutely incredible, the production level of this event. This isn't exactly one way, but this is kind of like a movie experience, right? Where you go to a theater and you sit in a room full with strangers and you consume content together. And I don't think we often think of this as an event, but it is. And it can be very, very impactful. It can achieve exactly what you want it to achieve. Where you walk away, you think about the themes of the event, you talk to your friends. If it's powerful enough, you want to be the first one at the premiere, right? So is that what you mean by engagement, where people are just so mentally engaged with the content and you present it in a way it's that impactful and that memorable? Or two, are you looking for two-way engagement? And there's a lot of good reasons to want two-way engagement. And I think that we tend to often think of this as engaging as event planners because we're very into the relationship side of things. So what does two-way engagement mean? There's a lot of creativity around this. Do you want, attendees to be able to have one-on-one time with each other where they're networking and having, a supplement to like an in-person networking experience? Is this a chat box? Is this like a Miro board where people are collaborating? There's a lot of room around what two-way engagement means. And so that's how I would strategically approach this question. And if you have the answers to those three questions to heart, so that's, what is your why? Why are you even convening? What is it that you want to get from your attendees as the host? What's in it for you? And three, what does engagement mean to you? It's going to make the platform selection really easy. So if we're able to put the slide up really quickly, I have a couple of logos up here. This is a drop in the bucket when it comes to the virtual options that you have. There's a few I don't have on here, like Hopin has some really cool features. I would really encourage in the chat, go ahead and share if you have any experience with these platforms or any not listed here and what you liked or what you didn't like about them. I think this is a great kind of crowdsourcing opportunity to learn from each other. And what we're going to learn, if you haven't already, is that there's a lot of pros and cons to each and every one of these. So it's also why I think muddy the waters really quickly with what you're trying to do with a virtual event. Pick the 1 to 2 things that you're really looking for and really hone in there.
So let's talk about the engagement from a two-way perspective, because I think a lot of folks that are tuning in today are probably trying to structure events where there is an exchange of ideas between both. I think that platforms definitely have gotten the hand of the first part, one-way engagement of kind of direct, theater-like experience, as you put it. Of the platforms that you used or that you're familiar with, are there some that you would point to as being like really strong in terms of networking and engagement, in terms of facilitating conversation between attendees?
So the one platform that has been my favorite when it comes to options for that type of engagement that feels a little more spontaneous is Hopin. There's some really cool ways to integrate some speed networking capabilities into there and some more video on type engagement between attendees that I think is pretty close to what we're looking for. But I also think that this is where, as planners, we have to be very strong facilitators in what we're looking for. If you're able to look at your attendee list and really think critically about what is going to be meaningful for these attendees, there's a lot of supplemental experiences that you don't need very advanced technology to create meaningful relationships and to help build meaningful relationships virtually. So it could be that you're planning we're doing small group cohorts before our next conference, for example,
Right.
where we've taken our list of 200, we're doing small groups of 10 to 15. There's a strong facilitator in that room. They're meeting before the conference and after with some prompts. And it's a chance to kind of try to recreate that spontaneous, networking option. Swap card is another one that Swap card, I think it's a little overwhelming, the number of features that they have. And I think that if you're not very intentional with how you design your event in Swap card, it can really be like you're distracted by a lot of shiny objects, right? But one of the things that I've liked is you're able to really very easily navigate people to networking rooms, and that's usually through Zoom. I think that's another natural way to create some more two-way engagement between attendees. Something else that's really interesting to consider when you're thinking about what is going to work really well for your attendees is thinking about trying to create engagement that is video off. So I think that this is an area where there's a lot of experimentation. And so when you look at Clubhouse and their model, for example, it's very successful. And actually, we're learning a lot. A lot of the data is showing there's a reason there's Zoom fatigue. You don't like looking at yourself on the monitor, and that's exhausting all day. Yeah. So, experimenting with some video off ways of communicating among attendees for networking, I think there's a lot of room for growth there.
Yeah, that's a good point, because kind of the rule of thumb when we at the beginning of the pandemic was, at least from a business perspective, was, well, if your camera's on, you're giving people a reason to like get out of their pajamas and start their day and whatnot. But I think really around like the 5-month mark or the 6-month mark, people were becoming very fatigued by the Zoom experience. You almost have to be a little bit more on and attentive than if you were even in a staff meeting taking notes, or if you were on a conference call where nobody could see you. So I think that's a really interesting point that you make. Maybe turning from that, maybe we can talk a little bit about production and some of the considerations and logistics there, both for in-person events and online events, and some of the best practices in terms of maybe production considerations, but also where you might get the best bang for buck, because I know a lot of organizations listening in are lean as they all are.
Yes. And investing in production is probably one of the best ways to get people engaged, because, it was really interesting how a year ago when we first all went virtual, there was a lot of leniency in what online events looked like and what the background was like and what the production level was like. I think it was almost comforting to see people in casual clothes in their kitchen, right? Mm-hmm. It was almost like a level of comfort because, hey, that's what I'm going through right now. But now attendees really expect, they really expect more. They expect the clean background. And so we actually at Atlas, we've taken a lot of work on this is a very low budget thing you can do. It takes time, but it's a very low budget way of investing in this, is that we've taken a lot of time to prep our speakers, and we go through speaker prep calls. And I actually have a video that I'm going to queue up now that includes some tips that you can walk through with your speakers.
Great.
Hello, thank you for being willing to speak at an Atlas Network event. This video will give you some helpful tips and reminders to make sure your presentation has full success. First step is to find a good location. Sit facing the windows to have the best lighting. If there is a direct light source behind you, it will cast a shadow and be distracting. Another tip, if you are using slides for your presentation, is to make them white or another flattering color, since it may reflect on your face. Look around you and make sure there is nothing distracting, like a television screen or dirty dishes. If possible, this is a great way to incorporate your branding. For example, grab your company hat and put it on the bookshelf behind you. Make sure to double check your surroundings so that your webcam doesn't pick up on anything you don't want the audience to see. Your camera should be at eye level. If needed, put a stack of books underneath your laptop. Once you and your webcam are in a good location, check your sound. A mic that plugs in will likely have the best quality. Then, think through the external noises like traffic, children, and animals. Close your door and mute your phone. Now that you are ready to present, here are some tips. Find a comfortable chair so you can maintain good posture. Wear comfortable and professional clothes. Solid colors look better on a screen. Similar to making eye contact in real life, look at the camera when talking. Just like an in-person presentation, practice beforehand and be conscious of use of filler words. Since this is a virtual presentation, 1 minute of speaking in person feels like 3 online, so remember to keep your remarks brief. Audience engagement is especially important during an online event. This can be done by asking a question for people to respond to in the chat box or by incorporating a poll. These engaging activities should be occurring about every 5 minutes to keep your audience engaged. If your session has multiple speakers, keep the format as conversational as possible. Thank you again for partnering with the Atlas Network, and good luck.
So yeah, lots of little tidbits in there, and a lot of it's cost-free, aside from maybe 30 minutes of your time with the speaker.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I noticed I've got my windows in the wrong place because it's casting a shadow, but I do have my books underneath the laptop to help raise it up. So maybe I could use a few more maybe, but anyway, those are some really helpful and valuable tips, particularly for online events. Do you think, Chelsea, that those, how would I put it, the same type of production value online is going to kind of continue to be expected and persist in a post-COVID era? Like, do you think, for instance, that virtual events will be as common as in-person events?
I think that for the next 2 years, we really still need to keep our skills very sharp on virtual events. I think 2 years from now, we'll really see if we start to stop caring about virtual as much. This is assuming that we live in a world where, COVID is less of a factor and that it's safe to convene in person, and we're not nervous about that anymore. So, for the sake of hybrid, I really think that virtual is going to be on the scene for a long time. Now, we are seeing a pretty big demand for in-person events too. And I think we see this too when we're trying to book with venues, right? 2022 and 2023 are booking up now. And so if you're trying to plan a conference or anything, start calling those hotels today. I think it'll waver. I think beyond the 2-year mark, we'll just we'll have to see how the demand changes.
Yeah. So thinking about the fact that we might be in this environment for some time, or if we are having an in-person event in that 2-year period, seems like a good time to talk about, as planners, what you should be looking for in your contracts, what you should be planning for in terms of emergency situations. My God, I hope we don't have another pandemic, but I think some of the best practices that you've learned throughout the course of the last year in terms of planning for the worst would be helpful to cover at this point.
That's a great segue to start talking about in-person events. And we at Atlas, we've actually hosted 2 in-person trainings so far in a very safe way. And so we have a little bit of experience into what that's going to look like. And so, and what we've really had in place that made that successful is we had a strong event response plan. But first, let me take a step back, and something that I think that this pandemic has really highlighted for us as planners is what our primary job is. So it's kind of like a flight attendant. On the surface, a flight attendant is accommodating all the guests. She or he is serving food, they're providing pillows, they're making sure everyone's comfortable, they're taking complaints. On the surface, that's what it is. But what is the real reason they're there? It's for the safety of everyone on the plane. It's the same thing for event planners, right? There's a lot of surface level, more exciting things than dealing with insurance and risk and contractual liabilities. But at its core, we're kind of there for safety as well. That's the most important thing. And so if you think about your role, just make sure that's kind of at the heart of it. And so there are 4 ways I think that you can, as we're emerging into away from all virtual into some in-person events, 4 baselines that you can make sure that you have covered. The first is, a no-brainer. Make sure that you know your government's rules and regulations on convening. It's a great place to start. Once it's legal to convene in certain groups, you're just going to follow those instructions. The second is to start speaking with venues. What we're seeing a lot recently is, even though, for example, in the state of Florida is very much open for events right now as a state as far as their government restrictions. But when you look at the specific venues, many of them are still imposing social distancing or, capacity limits on their property or mask mandates and so just make sure that before you sign a contract, you really understand what the venue's policies are and have a real conversation about enforcement. For example, if there is a mask mandate on behalf of your venue, who is responsible for enforcing that? And the answer may be that you end up needing to hire private security to, in a very polite way, make sure that you're reminding guests to abide by whatever restrictions you are in place. The third thing that you can do to make sure that you're prepared is, I'm going to talk about the event response plan on my next slide, but really make sure you're taking a chance to mitigate some legal risks. And I do want to kind of warn everyone about 2 of them that we're starting to see emerge. So the first one is, as you're reaching out to venues and you're deciding, okay, I want to, make this official. I want to start moving forward with the contract. I have seen that some hotels are bouncing back and they're sending in letters of intent instead of a contract. And so I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I've actually seen it, and it caught me by surprise because I really didn't know that much about letters of intent, and they're not totally new to the event industry. They're really helpful. When you're planning a last minute event, like maybe you're planning an event 5 days out and you don't have time to go through the whole process of a contract. It's close enough to the event. You're not very worried that the hotel's going to sell the space before you move in, but they're not legally binding. Right. So that's the risk. They're also useful if you're planning events like 5 years from now, when you're like, well, it's a long time for things to change. I don't want to commit to a contract, but let's kind of get this agreement with the hotel. Hotels are using them now for events that are coming up within the next couple of months. And they're doing this because they're really trying to mitigate the risk on their end. Yeah. So consider if that's what's right for your organization. And we're pushing for contracts, but just beware because they look like contracts. And the second thing that I think you should make sure that you're really in tune with what the government restrictions are and with what your venue's restrictions are is because beware of assuming a duty. So as an organization, if you're choosing to have additional restrictions or additional precautions in place that aren't required by the venue or by the government, you're entering into this assuming a duty category. So get a lawyer's opinion on this, because essentially what that means is that you may not be responsible for something, but once you take the responsibility, if you don't do it right, then you're liable. So if temperature checks aren't required and you decide we care about having those for all of our attendees, it's going to create an environment that feels more safe. Make sure you're doing that right. And you may want to consider some additional waivers or something in your terms and conditions that protects you, again, because you're kind of going above and beyond. So a safe rule of thumb is, to just follow what your venue has in place and to follow what your local governments have in place.
Would that apply to things, sorry to interrupt, Chelsea, would that apply to things like even making sure that like hand sanitizer or stations are available for guests? Or is that is that so common now at this point that your attendees would expect it and you as an event planner or host would not necessarily become liable in some way if somebody got sick at the event despite you offering hand sanitizer available?
So that's a great question. I guess my first gut reaction is that would be something that's responsible on behalf of the hotel, I would think. And so, that's a question for a lawyer. I'll be totally honest with you. I didn't think about hand sanitizer specifically. I was really thinking more along the lines of if you start enforcing a mask, like let's say a year from now, masks are not required.
Yeah.
Let's just say that's the space that we're in, and you as an organization start to impose something like that, but then you don't enforce it, right? I think those are very realistic.
And another one could well be proof of vaccination, right? I'm sure in the U.S., where you guys seem to value freedom a little bit more than some people and some jurisdictions in Canada, that would never cross your mind. But certainly government officials here have used that vaccine passports or whatnot would be required to do certain activities and participate in the economy. So I guess what you're getting at is if you want to go that far as an organization or a host of an event, but it's not required by your venue, you might be assuming a certain level of liability there. So to be very aware of that.
To be aware of that and to seek a lawyer's advice. I am not a lawyer, and I'm just approaching this from a very big picture perspective of this should be on your radar as a planner. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So are there other components of the emergency response plan that you'd like to cover? So I know I don't want to go too much into the weeds on this because folks that are listening in, some may be professional planners, but many are not, right? So what are the kind of key things that should consist or compose a good emergency plan or considerations people should make?
Sure. So if you have two things, and I think there are two things that are no-brainers, there's one thing you should have a one pager that you're providing to your staff on site. So an event response plan is something that you create for your organization in collaboration with your venue that is for use by your staff. It's your plan for an emergency. And yeah, what you see on the screen now is just a table of contents with examples of things you can include. But there were two things you were going to make sure you covered. It's one, the one pager. And what you want to make sure you include on that one pager is that you know where the nearest hospital is, you know where the nearest pharmacy is, you know where the nearest COVID testing site is. And even more important than that is how you're going to contact the security at the hotel. So a lot of times, there's those house phones in the hotel. If there is someone having a stroke, for example, obviously you have someone calling 911, and then you can be calling the hotel's security who have training for these types of things too on the house phone. And typically it's a number that you can dial. So that's a really useful piece of information to be able to provide to all of your staff at the event. So have that one pager, at least with that basic information. And then the second most important thing that covers all of your bases is your crisis team. You can't predict every single kind of emergency you're going to, come up with. I think it's very smart to think through specifically what do you do if someone attends your event and has a positive COVID test. I think that is one scenario that's worth having procedures lined out. But, if you just have a team in place who's ready to convene and respond to a crisis, it's probably the strongest asset that you can have to be prepared.
But do you have any advice around dealing with, I wouldn't put this as an emergency situation, but perhaps more of an annoyance, but people like guests at an event who might not be there in the spirit of what it is that's happening? Protesters, hecklers, people that are difficult to deal with in person and maybe even online, people that hijack a chat or a Q&A to spew things that, again, aren't in the spirit of the event. Any particular advice there or best practices on how to deal with those situations or mitigate them?
Yes. So for all of your events, you should have some terms and conditions that explains the kind of decorum that you expect at your event. And of course, also any, anything that's a big no. Like, for example, one of our big no's at our events is no undercover recording. Right. But we don't care if someone's taking a picture because they're excited they're there recording a speaker, but, someone who's recording without consent or, using a very small camera on their pocket or something along those lines. Those are grounds that we make clear from the start that, you're getting kicked out. That's not acceptable. And then it does make a lot of sense to, if you're concerned about hecklers, if you're concerned about protesters, you can include language in your contracts with the hotels that pretty much say that they are going to support you. You can ask hotels to add this, that they will support you in the enforcement of your of your terms and conditions. And it probably makes sense to hire private security as well, because you don't want your own staff interfacing with these people. That's all sorts of legal issues. Actually what I see is on the screen right now is it's a gift to everyone. It's a sample, COVID-19 contract language. Maybe I could even put this into the chat if I can just copy and paste it here from my screen, because I know it's a lot to copy down. So for those of you who are kind of anxiously scribbling away, I believe that was just sent through. Feel free to copy and paste it. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but just from my experience as an event planner, this is a pretty strong clause in favor of the group. And you can submit these to hotels, to venues for its consideration to protect you in the case of, of a COVID resurgence and, additional restrictions and lockdowns by the government, what you might see happen is the hotels might bounce back and say something like, they want to have a 30-day deadline to make a decision to cancel for COVID. If you have zero protection and you go to any protection, I would count that as a win.
Right. I just want to remind folks and encourage you, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those into the Q&A in the chat at any time, and we'll make sure that we get through any that come in. We've got about half an hour left in the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about moving beyond the online event and maybe a bit of a hybrid or, kind of pseudo online and in-person gathering. This is definitely a new space. Curious about your thoughts in the pros and cons of that. Certainly, if you're dealing with a geography like Canada or the US, there may be some merits to trying to offer part of your programming or your event online so that you're really increasing the maximum amount of people that can participate. Our conference that we have annually in March usually takes place in Ottawa. It's a far way to travel if you're coming from Calgary or Victoria or elsewhere in the country. So curious in your views on hybrid events, which sound great in theory, probably a little bit more difficult to make happen in practice. So curious in your thoughts on that.
Yes, this is the way of the future, right? And that's probably what everyone's boards want you to figure out and do. How do you accommodate everyone? So let's talk about it. And let's talk about some different ways that you might be able to kind of think about these two different audiences. So you need everything that we've already talked about in this hour plus some. How do you bring these two together? And I think probably the most powerful thing that you're doing when you create a hybrid event is that you're really thinking about creating a very big experience that a large group of people can be a part of. So you're really a part of something big and special and important and inclusive too. Kate, I don't know if you've experienced this, as I know that you're a mother now, but as I'm a mother too of two young children, so it makes it very hard to go to networking events. And when they all went virtual, it was such a gift. Now I could be included a lot easier. And so there's a lot of benefits to the virtual world as well, as long as it's kind of done right. So if we're able to pull that slide back up, I can kind of go through some of the experiences that are shared between the two different audiences. So some of those, I just have to make it bigger here. There we are for myself. Obviously a couple of shared experiences is the event content, delivering that to the two different sides, to the live and the virtual audiences. I think there are some clever ways to think about incorporating their input, such as live Q&A. And so, if you're able to have a facilitator at the live event who's delivering the content, have on their phone, somehow they know what questions are coming in, they can pose those to the speakers too and bring the two together. I think there's a lot of creativity around live streams. So you could live stream all the people watching in the Zoom room to the people who are attending in person and vice versa. Again, makes you feel like you're really a part of something. And you kind of have this common purpose. And then social media is also, I think, a no-brainer. There's lots of ways to create a lot of, engagement there. But then I think there's also, we have to be realistic. I think we, like I have the picture here of this futuristic hologram that we're trying to bring together. I don't think networking between the two audiences is a very accomplishable goal at this point. Some apps like Whova, we've used the Whova app as an event app before and have been pretty happy. And when everything went all virtual, they added on virtual event capacities as well. And so I think that there are some cool applications out there that can help you bring some of the audiences together, where you can see the guest list and maybe chat individually with people who are virtual or in person.
Something I've seen done, just to offer up something there, something I've seen done that's worked well for political type events or those where you're trying to generate conversation and exchange is we call them like kitchen dinner tables, or like family dinners online, right? Where you kind of group people really at random, but give them a topic related to what you've discussed to kind of debate amongst themselves or discuss in a more intimate setting. And I think that that is something, the creation of kind of intimate environments is actually a little bit more difficult to do in person if you've got a particularly large gathering, right? Because it requires more space and a little bit more logistics. Whereas if you open up some Zoom breakout rooms, to talk about certain topics, you're probably going to get a pretty good level of exchange and debate happening in a more intimate setting. That's just been something I've observed from the online experience.
You're exactly right, Kate. And you can be so intentional about those groupings, whereas an in-person event, there's some more spontaneity there about who makes connections, which is what we miss. But, there's a trade-off. And so I think that's exactly right. So, those are a couple of ways to think about virtual. I think, be realistic about how the audiences are separate, but how to create still a common experience. And then there's also this really interesting idea that has starting to manifest itself at the watch party kind of model. So you might be able to have, a lot of smaller events that you're pushing your content out to, right? And then, there are ways to create engagement, between the groups. I don't know as much about live engagement aside from social media, because again, if you're attending an in-person event, the whole point is that you want to interact with real people. So, but before the conference, after the conference, through social media, again, if you can create this sense of common purpose and the sense of a common why I'm engaging with this content, I think that's more powerful than probably, anything that we've really talked about here. There's a lot to consider in the hybrid world and a lot of experimentation that's coming.
Just on the point of social media, curious if you have any suggestions around how to best break out or delineate paid and unpaid content. And by that, I mean, if you're trying to get word out about an event, one of the first things you're going to think about is we need to put this all over our social media, right? Maybe we do a Facebook live stream or an Instagram live or something like that. The flip side of that is that if you're having people pay to attend an event, they feel that they're paying for something that is not going to be given for free online. Do you have any advice about how to make that determination, or any suggestions around what maybe you could offer for paying attendees and registrants at something versus those that might be consuming the content via social media?
So this is where your why really comes into place here, I think. And so, if your goal is just to broadcast this out to as many people as possible, but you still want to charge for the event, if you know that there are enough supporters who are going to pay a ticket and really see that amount as going towards supporting the cause because they connect with what you are trying to do and they care quite a bit about it. I think that you're going to be able to maybe get away with some of that live streaming, because I think they're going to understand that they're not paying for exclusivity. They're paying for to support what it is you're trying to do. However, if you are creating an event that is supposed to be more intimate, kind of like what you shared, and you're charging for it, but then giving away free tickets, I do think that is where you're going to run into some more issues. And it's very interesting. There's a nonprofit out there. The name is eluding me right now, but they essentially work with young adults who struggle with mental disorders. And the whole story is just very sad about, one who lost her life to bipolar disease. And they're selling for their fundraising gala, which was online, tickets for $1,500. And let me tell you right now, though, once I went through the whole, their whole value proposition for the events, I was like, sign me up. that amount is totally justifiable to me because I'm supporting the why. Right. I understand this is a virtual environment. I'm not going to get food out of this. And so hopefully that kind of gives you a few thoughts on how to approach it. I think communication strategies really come into play when you're trying to balance that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair consideration. And I've also seen some successful things done which have brought an event to people's homes. So I'm familiar with a charity in Ottawa that around the holidays typically has a very big gala event that is their major fundraiser for the year. Obviously not able to happen because of COVID. So what they did this year was they pivoted to a gala in a box. So your ticket price was actually very similar to what you would pay to go to the gala. And it is a charity, so there's a donation and tax receipt element there too. But in any event, attendees actually got a box mailed to their home in advance of the event that included a bunch of goodies from the organization. It included, gift cards to get a meal out and support a local business here in Ottawa. So people were able to make a night of it, even though they were just in front of their computer screens. It was black tie. So the ladies were wearing their best, and so are the guys. So there are ways to, I think, to get creative and think about how to bring an event to people's homes if you have the capacity and the resources to do it. So on that point, one of the big things people might be thinking about right now is monetizing their event. What they need to consider for an online option versus an in-person option. I think that there's some general best practices around if you're having an event in person, perhaps you're charging more or not. So I'm curious in your view on monetization of events, Chelsea, and the best practices there.
Yeah, and so this is actually very, very interesting topic because we're currently looking at our Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner that we're going to do in a hybrid setting, and that balance of how to price it in the way that also accommodates if you're faced with gathering restrictions, right? And so what a little bit of our approach, the way that we're approaching this is to really look at what is the minimum that you think you'll be able to gather and kind of setting that, pretending that's your maximum, right?
Okay.
And so really just setting the price based on that. If you can only have 300 people, that's what you're anticipating. And then maybe if social distancing restrictions are lifted, if gathering restrictions are lifted, you could do 500 people. But setting the price and really making sure that you're prepared to cover your costs based on that minimum is probably one of the it's the most risk averse approach, right? And then when you think about virtual, I do think that monetizing virtual is a challenge. I think that sponsorships really come into play. So if you're able to include commercials and have people, sponsors come in and give you $5,000, $10,000 here or there to help cover the cost, but then they get some promotion out of that deal. That's probably a great way to offset costs compared to having many people purchase tickets at a larger amount. And I do think that too, as we get into hybrid, as we've already talked about, virtual is so inclusive. And so I think that you might be able to get some, sponsor and donor support around, we're so happy we can meet in person, but let's not forget that we can't convene everyone in person yet, or as many as we'd like to yet. Can you help us bring this experience to people in their homes who aren't able to, join us for whatever reason?
Those are really good considerations. I would just say 300 people at an event, I think, will be illegal for the next 10 years in Ontario. At least that's how we're feeling with lockdown right now. But you raise a really good point in terms of sponsorship. And I wanted to ask about whether or not you think it would be a good idea to offer different tiers of sponsorship for a hybrid event if you were doing something online versus you were doing something in person. Is that a way that we might be able to kind of pull different tiers of sponsors in or levels of sponsors? I'm thinking ahead to the fact that so many companies have been hard hit by COVID. Their ability to sponsor events is not going to rebound even at the same pace of when we are having events in person. So curious in your thoughts on, what people should consider when it comes to sponsorship tiers. If there's any best practices that you would suggest there. I'm thinking also there's going to be a lot of competition in the event space. I think the pendulum may even swing the other way. We've gone from a suite of online events. Maybe once we are out of COVID restrictions, there's going to shift to being a real in-person event fatigue again. And a lot of the places that people would go to hit up for dollars are going to be, competing with other events and other sponsorships. So any advice there in terms of maybe two sets of sponsorship requirements or levels?
I think there's probably a lot of creativity there. And so I could certainly see deals where I think we're looking at smaller banquet tables, for example, for a long time. So maybe, unfortunately, you might not be able to do a sponsorship at the table for 10 for a while, but you can do a table of 6 plus, 10 virtual tickets and access to all the recorded content. Don't forget about that recorded content. A lot of events in the past have sold that after the event. You could include that as a benefit for your sponsors and for purchasing a ticket where maybe you're attending in person, but so you don't need the virtual stuff as much. but you get the recorded content. And there might be a way to include that. One clever sponsorship option is to consider doing a sweetheart table or smaller tables of 4. And so a sweetheart table is a table, for 2 people. Maybe you're going to have attendees who want to socially distance and they will want to, remain in that level of precaution for a while, but they want to support the event and they still want to be a part of it. They feel comfortable enough being in the room with others, but they want their space. So I think tables of 2 or tables of 4 are something that are that we can certainly consider. Maybe they just want to bring another, 2 couples who know each other. So those are just a few creative ideas to consider.
One question that's come in, and it's a good one. By virtue of going online for a lot of events, people tend to register very last minute because the logistical kind of requirements of getting to and fro from events are gone, right? You can just pop open your computer screen and be online and be there. So as a planner, when you're trying to let your speakers know how many people have signed up, or even just be prepared for, how successful or not your event may be based on uptake, any advice that you would have there in terms of registration or trying to encourage people to register at the earliest opportunity?
That's a gut-wrenching position that we've tracked that, right? Like the majority of our registrations for our events are in the 2 weeks before. Right. If I'm honest, I don't really know if just for all virtual events, I don't know if we've tapped into the way to get people to commit sooner. There's just so much flexibility, other than we know that we've tracked that. And so what we've actually done is that just means we've pivoted our strategy a little bit. So in our communications, so we send out fewer communications, 4 months out. Sure. Not nothing. You make sure people know about the dates. You make sure there's not conflicting things. You do try to drum up a little bit of excitement, make sure it's on people's radars. But in those 3 to 7 days before your virtual event, that's when you're hitting your audience heavy with promotions. So, in social media as well. So that's how we've approached. To us, it's kind of like a fact. I don't know if we've really tried to shift it so that people register early, but you can make some changes that make sense. Yeah.
Do you think that price structure is an effective way to go about that? So offering an early bird registration price versus, if you register the day before the event, you might be paying a premium. Have you seen that deployed with success?
That's a great idea. This is the first time I'm actually hearing of that strategy. So Kate, you're ahead of me on this one. No, I think that's actually, that's a really smart approach. And, when you think about pricing for virtual events, I think part of this too is really knowing your audience and who you're targeting. If you're targeting all new people, there's just that you need to convince to be invested in what you're saying, that you need to convince to be invested in your why. I just don't, with all the competition out there, I think that your value proposition needs to be so clear to them and that they need to identify with it so well to really buy into a virtual event. There's just so much free content out there. But, if this is an audience of, people who have supported your organization for years and they attend your live events all the time and they know they're great, that's where you're just going to have more success with cost structures that are a little bit more ambitious.
Yeah. And I think if you've got an already engaged audience and we assume that the value proposition is really clear to them, something else to think about might be some exclusive content. And I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier for those that maybe do register in advance. Maybe if there's a way to break out part of your event as content and offer something in advance for those that register before, name the date, they get a sneak preview of a conversation or something that may be happening, or they have access to content that would not be otherwise offered on the program. So that's something else people could think about as a means of kind of trying to entice registration a little bit earlier.
It's a great idea, Kate. That's excellent. We're going to borrow that. I'm taking my notes.
It's all yours. Free. Ideas are free. So I'm also curious, and we've got about 10 minutes left for those that have any additional questions to please feel free to submit those. Curious in who and what types of organizations are doing this right. So after you've taken in the last year of events, curious if there's any that you would point to as like really models for success that people can look to.
Well, I would say that this is actually a very impressive production set. So well done, Kate. I would be amiss to not compliment you.
Your check is in the mail, but that was actually not a planned endorsement. But thank you. Yeah.
I think that organizations that really get this right understand the value of investing in production. And so I really do think that a huge mistake a lot of planners make, and I think maybe I made it in the very early on days of virtual, is you get very distracted by shiny objects because there's so many different types of functions you can include in events, in these virtual events, that end up becoming distracting from your value proposition, from what you're trying to do with your event. And so the ones that are really engaging, that you just feel sucked in and you just feel like this is, was such a great use of your time, is where they've really focused in on that why question. And then they've figured out how to produce the event to the caliber that gives that why question that gives that why question, does it justice?
Right on. I also wanted to ask a little bit about prioritization of spending. So you make a great point, Chelsea, in terms of event production and how that should really be a factor and a consideration for planners. If you have a really small pool of resources, how would you divide, for example, promotion versus production? So like, is it a 50-50 split? And thinking as well about event promotion, are there any particular sites that you would suggest or platforms? We've heard a little bit about in earlier presentations, bang for buck on Facebook ads, for example. So just curious in your thoughts about the division between promoting an event and the budgeting there, or marketing it, versus the actual event itself.
Well, if I'm honest, I don't know if that's really exactly my area of expertise. So I'm sorry about that, Kate. I don't know if I can really comment in a thoughtful way on that. We really have found a lot of value in personalized promotions for virtual events. And so that's where I think we've gotten a lot of our bang for our buck, rather than kind of, and I think it's maybe a little bit different when you consider our audience for our events. Our events are very intimate, and we have a very precise network of people who we are promoting to, that we have very good relationships with. And so we've had we've really enjoyed that. We like that personal touch. And so wherever you can incorporate that as well, it's a human element too, where it's not just a computer screen. You're reminding people that you have a relationship with the organization. I think that's the best advice I can give from my experience.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I just wanted to ask if there's any kind of final pieces of advice or best practices that you would share, thinking ahead to kind of the next phase of events for folks as they plan either in person or online or hybrid. Any other, you've talked about a couple of different platforms, Hopin, Whova, and a few others that you would recommend, but are there any other specific kind of like tactical having a good emergency response plan? Are there any other specific tactics that you would recommend people take away from our conversation this afternoon?
Yeah. So, what's really interesting, I think, for event planners is we've always been very natural born leaders, but more than ever, our facilitation skills have needed to be very strong for virtual events. And so this is a great time to really invest in a lot of that. And to, I think there's a lot of concern that a virtual event's going to be awkward. And so it's only awkward if you make it awkward, right? And so really making sure that who you have on stage and who you have facilitating the experience is going to totally own it. If it's a gala, wear a tux, have all of your staff, for our gala last year, we wore our beautiful gowns and our tuxedos and we posted that all over social media and we just went all in, and it was part of what drummed up all of that excitement. And so just really making sure that you have the leadership skills and the people who are in the room kind of know how to own that experience. And I say in the room, in the virtual space, I think that is something else that you want to really keep in mind when you're choosing a platform is how you can facilitate that experience. I don't want to give Swapcard a bad name. I think that they are a good tool at a lower budget for a lot of virtual events, but where I've seen it work very successfully, Swapcard is one where there's a lot of different features and functions to add on. And I think that's kind of easy to where you can get distracted from shiny objects, like I suggested. And so, where I've seen success is where in the pre-conference planning with attendees, you really facilitate what that experience is going to be like. You set expectations, you get buy-in on how to use it, and you really feel like you're being led through a journey rather than just showing up on a web page and having to kind of figure it out for yourself. As event planners, we're kind of becoming storytellers, we're becoming stronger leaders, facilitators, guides, really growing those skills and don't deprioritize them.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that by going online, you do open yourselves up to having a greater diversity of speakers geographically, I think is the main thing there. So, for those that are listening that have tried to organize speaker-based events or even fundraisers where you're bringing in a special speaker, your ability to bring somebody in from Australia, for example, like our next speaker will be from, that has changed a lot because of moving online, and for the better, I would say, right? Because it is a big commitment to try and pull somebody from the UK or even the US to Canada for an event. By going online, you give them the ability to do that with a far greater ease than in person. So that's something people should consider. One other final question that's just come in, and it's specific to Zoom. Any specific thoughts on Zoom meetings versus Zoom webinars?
Very good question. Yes. So when we first pivoted to all virtual conferences about a year ago, we really tried to take on this approach of as much video on as possible. And I think this was when all virtual was new. Zoom fatigue really wasn't an element. And I think that we were all kind of craving that connection that made you feel like you knew what was going on elsewhere in the world and with other planners and with other organizations. And so at the very beginning of this, we used Zoom meetings because that allowed for attendees to be camera on, and you can do the breakout rooms, which is a really cool feature. What I will say is the security implications of Zoom meetings. We did have a particular Zoom bomber. What happens is if that access to the meeting gets out there are these, I just imagine, kids in their basements who think it's really funny to kind of go in and sabotage an event. And there's really doesn't seem to be like a rhyme or reason for it, but that was a little bit of what happened to us in our first virtual event. And so you do have to consider that, where a Zoom webinar, you just have a lot more control over the content, over the delivery. And now, again, I think the times have kind of changed where people they're not really all about that video on experience anymore. They kind of want to break from that when they're engaging online. So it depends on the size of your event, depends on the audience, it depends on what exactly it is that you're trying to do. So those are some ways that you might want to approach that question between the two.
Excellent stuff. Okay, well, we are at time. So I just want to say thank you again so much, Chelsea, for imparting your wisdom and advice with me and us. This has been really helpful in terms of thinking through all the different considerations we need to make post-COVID about having a gathering that provides a lot of value to attendees and is done in an impactful way. So thank you so much for your time. And for now, we will return to Troy in the studio for a break and then our next session.